Hello everybody, today I'd like to read a chapter of A Little History of Economics by Niall Kishtainy. Chapter 5, Nature's Bounty. At the Palace of Versailles, one afternoon in 1760, François Quesnay, 1694 to 1774, was in a state of despair. His friend and intellectual collaborator, the Marquis de Mirabeau, had just published a book which had annoyed a lot of people, called The Theory of Taxation. It sounded really rather dull, but it had got Mirabeau thrown into prison. Quesnay was the doctor of Madame de Pompadour, King Louis XV's favourite mistress. A few years earlier, at the age of 60, he'd become, with Mirabeau's help, the leading figure in a group of thinkers who gathered in Mirabeau's place every Tuesday to talk ideas. They were the world's first school of economists. Quesnay was a well-known figure in the royal court, and he made his powerful criticisms of the French economy in a respectful way. But Mirabeau was a hothead. In his book, he trumpeted Quesnay's proposal that taxes on France's peasant farmers be done away with and the aristocrats taxed instead. The king was furious and had Mirabeau locked up. Madame de Pompadour tried to soothe her worried doctor, telling him that she tried to calm the king and that it would all blow over. Quesnay gloomily remarked to her that whenever he was in the presence of the king, all he could remember was that this is a man who could have my head cut off. As Mirabeau had discovered, taxes are a delicate matter. Rulers have to tax their subjects. How else to pay for their court and for soldiers to defend the realm? France in those days spent lots of money fighting wars and needed even more to pay for the king and noblemen's splendid castles, banquets, and jewelry. First, though, there's the problem of who to tax, and then how much to tax them. The ruler has to keep the powerful aristocrats on side, so taxing them isn't easy. If taxes on the peasants become too heavy, they might stop working, or worse, they might rebel. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the previous king's finance minister a century earlier, had this balancing act in mind when he said, "The art of taxation consists in plucking the goose as to obtain the largest amount of feathers with the least possible amount of hissing." Quesnay believed that the French society and its economy, had been plucked so hard that it was practically bald. A few decades later, the goose hissed loudly and rose up in revolution. For now, though, it wasn't so much hissing as dying. Compared to Britain, France's agriculture was backward and unproductive. The peasant farmers were living a wretched existence. Life in the countryside was a long, hard grind full of poverty and famine. Quesnay blamed the high taxes imposed on the farmers, which went to the royal court and the aristocrats. In contrast, the aristocrats and the wealthy clergy didn't have to pay any taxes at all. Quesnay said that agriculture was special. Nature harnessed in the fields, rivers, and hunting grounds were the ultimate source of a nation's wealth. This is why the ideas of his circle of thinkers, the first to call themselves economists, became known as the physiocracy, which meaning rule by nature. The physiocrats said that wealth was the wheat and pigs produced by the land. Farmers used their crops or the earnings from selling them to feed themselves. In addition, they sometimes produce a surplus that can be sold to other people. Quesnay believed that the surplus was the life force of the economy. He called it the net product. It was what was left over from farming production, the total product, after the farmers had taken what they needed. He said that the net product could only be produced by people alongside nature, by the fisherman making a catch in the river, by shepherd grazing sheep in the grasslands. The physiocrats believed that the net product sprang forth from the economy according to laws of nature, which were unchanging and God-given. It was unwise for a ruler to tamper with them, but that was exactly what the French monarchy had done, they said. It had bled the peasants dry and hobbled the country's agriculture. Even worse, while the farmers were exploited, the state showed the craftsmen and merchants in the towns with privileges. France had a maze of laws designed to build up its industry, in large part by protecting manufacturers from competition at home and from abroad. Much of it was along the lines suggested by the mercantilist thinkers whom we met in the last chapter. Merchants and craftsmen defended their privileges through their guilds. Guilds were organizations going back to medieval times, and they were often very powerful. A look at Paris some decades earlier shows how far the guilds would go to protect their members' positions. In June 1696, the city's buttonmakers had been in an uproar. They were barging into tailors' shops, searching for illegal buttons that threatened their domination of the trade in silk buttons. The problem was that some enterprising tailors had begun to make buttons out of wool. The Guild of Buttonmakers complained, and the authorities issued a ban on woolen buttons. The shopkeepers of Paris ignored the ban. And now the wardens of the guild were hunting down rebellious tailors, even trying to arrest anyone in the street found wearing woolen buttons. Today, it's amazing to think that a manufacturers' association had such power over what people were allowed to buy. The privileges enjoyed by the button makers helped them make money. The physiocrats believed that manufacturers' profits were possible only because of the privileges given to them, not because they created any real surplus. Manufacturing industries were in fact completely incapable of creating a surplus, said Quesnay. Button makers earn a profit from selling buttons only because of the labour and silk they use up in making them. All they do is transform what nature has already created. Quesnay therefore called manufacturing a sterile activity. What was worse was that the French state's promotion of industry had taken many resources away from productive farms and put them into many sterile industries. He was even more critical of the bankers and merchants, who, in his view, were economic parasites who shuffled around the value created by other people without contributing any of their own. Quesnay, doctor as he was, saw the economy as a giant organism, with a precious economic surplus acting as its vital blood supply. To explain the idea that he made the first economic module, a simplified picture of the economy. Quesnay created it in his ingenious tableau economic table. He drew a series of zigzags to represent the circulation of resources around the economy. Farmers produced the surplus and paid it in the form of rent to the aristocrats who owned the land and who then bought silk buttons and silver candlesticks from the craftsmen. The craftsmen in turn bought food from the farmers, so completing the cycle. The economy was a circular flow of surplus between farmers, landowners, and craftsmen. When the surplus increases, more resources flow between them and the economy grows. When the surplus falls, the economy shrinks. Just what the physiocrats believed had happened in France. Quesnay's zigzags impressed and baffled people. Once Mirabeau had worked out what they meant, he declared Quesnay to be the wisest man in Europe, as clever as Socrates. The table was certainly influential. Later, economists including Adam Smith praised it. And to this day, the idea of a circulation of resources between workers, companies, and consumers is fundamental to our understanding of the economy. The doctor had a cure for France's illness. The main thing was to increase the surplus produced in the economy. Mirabeau had landed himself in hot water trying to explain just how to do it. Quesnay's zigzags showed the problem with taxing the farmers. Higher taxes left them with fewer seeds to sow the following year and less money to spend on improving their tools. If the landowning aristocrats alone were taxed, then the farmers would be left with more resources with which to cultivate the land. This would help to increase the overall surplus of the economy. In the end, even the aristocrats would benefit because the economy would get bigger. An argument that had fallen on deaf ears when the unlucky Mirabeau was imprisoned. As well as being oppressed by heavy taxes, the farmers weren't allowed to export corn and had to follow rules on how they could sell it to their own countrymen. The restrictions lowered the price they earned, reducing the surplus still further. Quesnay urged the state to release agriculture from the stifling controls and to abolish the privileges enjoyed by merchants. He was arguing for a policy of laissez-faire, literally meaning allowed to do. We still use the French phrase today to describe a hands-off economics policy by the government. Physiocrats had some influence on policy. For example, when the French government in the 1760s made it easier for farmers to sell their corn. Later, Quesnay's school of thought went into decline, and he retreated from practical questions of economics to the abstract delight of geometry. Quesnay was thoroughly modern in trying to find laws to describe the behavior of the economy and in depicting them in models. Today, this is the method of economics. Before him, the economy was seen through the lens of religion and tradition, or when religion was left out, as by the mercantilists. Through a fog of conflicting ideas, hardly a clear set of principles. In arguing that the economy was often best left alone, he anticipated a belief of many of today's economists that it's often better for the government not to meddle in the economy, for example, by imposing lots of heavy taxes. He was revolutionary in locating the source of economic value firmly in real things, wheat, pigs, and fish, rather than in money alone. But in restricting the source of value to agriculture, the physiocrats were stuck in the past. They were writing just before an economic revolution that was to transform Europe, in which manufacturers would create value by making goods more cheaply and by inventing new ones. Nature's bounty would soon bear fruit in the factories, not just in the rivers and fields. In the end, Quesnay was both a critic and defender of France's economic system. He was bold to argue for taxes on France's aristocrats. Not having to pay taxes was a privilege that they held dear and an important symbol for their status in society. He was bold too for criticizing France's kings for smothering their economy. In the end, Quesnay's worries about annoying the king didn't come to much. After Mirabeau had disgraced himself with his book, Madame de Pompadour helped him get released, and Quesnay made it to ripe old age, outliving his king by a few months. Although Quesnay risked upsetting the rich and powerful, he was loyal to them. He spent his days padding along palace corridors to audiences with the king and Madame de Pompadour. He was very much a part of Europe's old regime of kings and queens and believed in the division of society into classes of aristocrats and peasants. So, even though he urged the king to alter his approach to the economy, he still wanted an all-powerful monarch to rule over everything. Even bold economists like him often have to think within the terms of the most powerful people in their societies. After Quesnay died, the Francis aristocrats got swept away in streams of blood when the mighty revolution of 1789 shattered the old regime of kings, dukes, and peasants. Economists today discarded Quesnay's faith in the absolute authority of monarchs, but he cleared a path for them towards today's modern form of economics. That's all for today. Bye-bye.